Hello and welcome. These last two lectures are going to be done on video, and they're going to be talking more about the difference between Theravada and Mahayana in general. That would be this one. And then in the next one, differences between the different kinds of Mahayana and a little bit about the spread of Buddhism over the centuries. So let's start this time by looking at the main branches of Buddhism. I'll put myself down in the corner here, out of the way of the text, hopefully. First of all, we have three branches here, but you ought to know that there's really kind of a litmus test rule, and that is that if you're not Theravada, you are Mahayana. And Theravada, as we talked about in the first couple lectures, is the tradition of the elders, and it is the kind of Buddhism that seems to have most faithfully preserve the teachings of the Buddha on earth without adding any later revelations, any later sacred texts. Theravada does not consider the Buddha to be divine in any way. He is the man who was the enlightened one, the Buddha, the Tathagata, the truth bearer for our age, just as in the coming age there will be another that will fulfill the same function. But once the Buddha died, his teaching was over. And in Theravada, nobody believes the Buddha is still answering your prayers, or, they don't attribute any kind of deity to the Buddha. There was a time that Theravada was often called Hinayana, which means a small vessel. In fact, when you see Hina, you can just kind of think hindered vessel. It can be a disparaging term and was probably first coined by Mahayanists, so we don't use it anymore. I mean, if someone wants to be called Hinayana, by all means call them that, but Theravada is generally the more respectful term. Anything that is not Theravada falls in a category called Mahayana, the greater vessel. When you see Maha, think Mejor, or major, greater. And one of the things about Mahayana that's greater is they have more scriptures. Now, there are many different kinds of Mahayana that are very, very different from each other, but all of them stand in contrast to Theravada in that Mahayana has added many other scriptures over the centuries after the Buddha's ministry on earth was over. And they see it more as a progressive revelation where greater things were revealed later on. And this is the big difference. And as I said before, the litmus test is, do you think that any of the later Sanskrit sutras are authoritative or inspired? And if the person says yes, they're Mahayana, because no Theravadan would respond yes to that message. And when I say Sanskrit sutras, Sanskrit is a language. There are two different sacred languages in India in Buddhism, and in Theravada, the main texts are written in what's called Pali, which is the older tradition. And most of the later texts are written in Sanskrit. So when we speak of these Sanskrit sutras, we're speaking of those religious writings that only Mahayana accepts as being authoritative and inspired. Now, another reason that Mahayana is called the greater vessel is because it more successfully transcended cultural and religious boundaries as it spread around the world. And it was much more open to syncretizing elements of the culture and religion of those countries it was moving into. So if you want to talk about syncretism, Mahayana, the different forms of Mahayana that are very different from each other, are a great example, because the syncretism has a lot to do with why these different forms in Mahayana developed in very, very different ways. And when you see how different they are, you might want to ask the question, why are they all called Buddhism? Well, it's because they're all, in some sense, founded on the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, though how they build on that foundation, obviously, is very, very different in many cases. Now, our third entry here is actually a form of Mahayana called Vajrayana. Today, we usually call it Tibetan Buddhism, because Tibet is where Vajrayana actually grew and prospered for many, many centuries, until the mid-20th century, when the government of Mao Zedong, the communist, or more specifically socialist, kind of part Marxist, part Leninist, and part Maoist government took over and ended the whole imperial history of China. And at that point, much like the USSR, the socialist or communist government, that involved most of Russia, and fell apart finally during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. So some of you might not even remember that, but when I was a kid, boy, the communist threat, that was what everybody was worried about. But anyway, as you probably know, they also forbade, if you will, any kind of religious affiliation. And Mao Zedong and his People's Republic of China, or PRS, really did the same thing when they took over and annexed Tibet and made it a part of China again. And they saw the religion of the Tibetan Buddhists to be a threat to the authority of the government. And this is one of the things about communism or socialism that's important to understand, and that is it only works if you see your main obligation as to the state or to the government of your country, if you will, and you see your main responsibility as fulfilling your position in that society. The problem with religion is religion claims to represent a higher authority that can often challenge social norms. And in this case, in a communist government, religion is seen as being subversive. So again, in the midst of the 20th century, all religion, not just Buddhism, but all religion was outlawed in China. Today, and I don't know when you're watching this, but it's the year 2020 now. Today, most religions are allowed back in China because China is doing business with most of the world, and they don't want to be seen as the ultimate, human rights abusers or anything. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on when we get to the history of Buddhism. But suffice to say, that Tibetan Buddhism was not only the major religious form in Tibet before the People's Republic of China in the 20th century, but the leaders of Tibet were actually the lamas of Vajrayana Buddhism, and the lamas are the enlightened monks, the leaders. And you probably heard of the Dalai Lama, the highest one. The Panchen Lama is another one that the Chinese government disappeared. And the Dalai Lama was so in 1959, I think he was about 25 or 26 or so when he was compelled by his followers to flee when the Chinese army was coming. He would have been happy to stand and be a martyr, but his followers convinced him that they would much rather have a leader in exile than a martyr. And so, of course, the Dalai Lama is much older today, but he still stands as a force calling for peace in the world. And he is the Chinese government's worst nightmare, because he constantly exposes the human rights abuses of the Chinese government. Of course, he can never go back to Tibet. If he ever did, the Chinese government would disappear him in a hurry. And there are a lot of people that are still calling for the Chinese government to relax restrictions on Tibet, especially religious traditions. And today, while so many religions are allowed back into China, they are not allowed to be subversive. You can't stand up in a sermon and talk about what's wrong with the Chinese government. They will shut you down. In America, we almost feel like it's our obligation to speak against the government in some religious groups, but that doesn't happen in China. And so one of the few religions that's actually not allowed back in China is Vajrayana, or as we call it today, Tibetan Buddhism, because it is seen as being quite subversive. And so that's why the Dalai Lama can't go home. If you'd like to learn more about that, there's a movie that you can watch. That is a Martin Scorsese film. I'm sure you've heard of him, and I believe it won an Academy Award for cinematography or something. But it was called Kundun, spelled Kundun, and it was all about the early life of the Dalai Lama until he actually had to flee for his life in his mid-20s as the Chinese army was coming to wipe them out. It's a very interesting movie, and you can learn an awful lot about the problem in Tibet today without having to do much work except sit back and enjoy a nice movie. Anyway, so Vajrayana is a form of Mahayana, and there's something that makes it a little bit distinctive. First of all, it is the most tantric form of Buddhism. In other words, it has many rituals, and it actually sees the rituals as conduits through which some kind of spiritual power, energy, or benefit or enlightenment is being disseminated. And Theravada does not believe that at all. As we talked about with the Buddha, he does not see any benefit in worshiping gods or any kind of religious rituals of any kind in attaining enlightenment. Now, maybe the gods can help your corn grow, but they can't help you attain enlightenment. They're trapped in samsara just like you are and can't get themselves free. And we discussed this in a previous lecture, so hopefully this is ringing a bell here. Mahayana is very different than Theravada, and that is, for the most part in Mahayana, some kind of help is available, whether it's from gods or other Buddhas or Bodhisattvas or rituals or whatever. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. For now, Vajrayana is the most ritually based form of Buddhism, which makes it very, very different from Theravada. Also makes it very, very different from Zen as well, and very different from Pure Land, which is closer to something like Christianity almost. Like I say, these forms are all very different, and we're going to get into this and talk about how they became the way they are. And I made a final note down here that many concepts we're going to be studying are not covered in the text that you're using, obviously. So once again, the litmus test between Theravada and Mahayana is if you believe in the authority or the inspiration or the benefit of any of the later Sanskrit sutras that were written after the Buddha's life, then you are by definition Mahayana, because Theravada holds only to the teachings of the Buddha and the interpretations of those actual teachings that he made when he was on earth. And if you go to the very last page, we'll very briefly do this here. This is just a comparison of a few things on Theravada and Mahayana. The very top, you'll see Theravada, their sacred scriptures are called the Tripitaka, which means the three baskets, and they're written in that ancient language called Pali. The term canon means those scriptures that are authoritative or inspired, accepted as such. So that canon in Theravada is written in the ancient language of Pali and is called the three baskets or the Tripitaka. In Mahayana, the later scriptures that were written in Sanskrit are called the Sanskrit Sutras. And again, only Mahayana accepts the later Sanskrit Sutras. And we'll talk more about the differences between these two later on. But I thought I'd go ahead and get kind of this out of the way in the beginning, although we will come to it again. So once more, Vajrayana is a form of Mahayana. Just like Pure Land, Jodoshu, Jodoshinshu, or Zen, Chan, Jhana, whatever you want to call it. Nichiren or its offshoot Soka Gakkai. Those are the ones that you're mainly going to run into in this country, and of course Theravada. And so those are the ones we're mainly going to be talking about. Now, we're going to talk about Theravada here. And everything on this page is going to make more sense when you realize that Mahayana is very, very different in most of these areas. So kind of file this away, and on the next slide when we get to Mahayana, we're going to do some comparison and see how it's different. Number one in Theravada, as I already mentioned, the Buddha is an enlightened teacher, the Buddha, the Tathagata, the Shakyamuni, but he is not a god, he is not a deity. If you see, for instance, a Theravada monk who is seated in front of a 20-foot high statue of the Buddha, he is not worshiping the Buddha. He is not praying to the Buddha. A Theravada monk would be contemplating the Buddha's life, his teachings, his character, this type of thing. So, and we're going to see in Mahayana that's very different. In most forms of Mahayana, they very much believe that they can pray to that Buddha, Siddhartha, or many, many other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Seems crazy, but we'll talk about where they all come from. But in Theravada, there's one Buddha. His name is Siddhartha Gautama, as we've already talked about. And there is one Bodhisattva. That means he's the Buddha in waiting. He is going to be the Buddha or the Tathagata of the coming Yuga. And his name is Maitreya. Now, all forms of Theravada also acknowledge Maitreya. But in Theravada, there's only two Buddhas, Siddhartha and Maitreya. And Maitreya, again, is called the Bodhisattva because he's the Buddha of the next age. When we get to Mahayana, you're going to find out that there are many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and we're going to talk about where they all come from. The line right above this would not add to the Buddhist teachings preserved in the Pali Canon, called the Tripitaka, the three baskets. We discussed this. The Bodhisattva Maitreya is going to be the Buddha of the next age. Maitreya is also called Miruko in Japan and Miluo or Milofo in China. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to the next lecture, the final video. As I mentioned before, enlightenment is by individual effort. No help from gods or rituals will avail. And hopefully you remember our story about the Hindu gods that tried to help Siddhartha when he was under the banyan tree trying to break through to enlightenment and could not find a way to help him. And we talked about the other deity, Mara, who actually tried to stand in his way but was not able to prevent him. And so what Siddhartha learned from this is that the Hindu gods are of no help whatsoever. So he never really says he doesn't believe in them. And like I say, they might be helpful to make your corn grow or bring the rain or something, but they're not helpful in any way making it more possible for you to attain the enlightenment that is often called nirvana. And there are some other terms for it in different forms of Buddhism, like Satori and Zen Buddhism, and we'll talk about this. So the gods can't help you with this, and rituals can't either. It's by your own effort. The Theravada focus is more on the Sangha. Now, we talked about the Sangha, the order of monks, and remember that during the Buddha's life, Buddhism was a monastic movement. In fact, that's one of the things that makes it kind of unique as one of the world religions. Jainism falls in this category too, is they were both created as monastic movements. And later on, they developed lay followings, obviously, or we wouldn't even know they exist. But during the Buddha's life, if you wanted to follow his teachings, you had to leave society. That means your vocation according to your varna and ashrama and your family and everything else, and you had to join his renunciant group, his group of monks, which, as we said, is called a sangha. And the reason is very simple. The Buddha is telling you that everything that Hindu society and Hindu teaching is teaching you about who you are and why you are and what your responsibility is, and the only path to enlightenment is all wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. And it's impossible to live in a society where you have to acquiesce to these things, where you have to respond to your responsibility in these areas. It's impossible to live in a society like that and pursue any kind of enlightenment that requires you to completely reject those illusory ideas. So again, Theravada begins as a monastic movement, and even today, 2,500 years later, Theravadins see the Sangha as the heartbeat of the religion. No Theravadin would really think that they could attain enlightenment in this life and escape reincarnation and finally attain nirvana if they weren't at least an enlightened monk in a monastery. Okay, it's not that there's a rule, it's just that's the way it's understood. If you're not detached enough from all of the lies and illusion of society to join a sangha, then you're obviously not detached enough to attain nirvana in this life or when you die, and you're going to come back again. So a lot of the commoners, or village people, laity as we call them, when asked about this, obviously they may not demonstrate a whole lot of deeper theological knowledge. You'd have to talk to a Theravada monk to discuss some of the things we talked about in the last two lectures. But most of the villagers are hoping that if they lead a good life and they store up a lot of merit, that maybe in the next life they will have enough willpower to actually join the Sangha, become a monk, attain enlightenment, and then finally attain nirvana at the end of their life, not coming back to be reincarnated according to the cycle of samsara anymore. Hopefully that all is pretty clear. So the Theravada focuses more on the Sangha. The number one thing that a layperson in Theravada can do that stores up merit is to support the Sangha. And as we mentioned before, they provide all the food for the monks. The monks come out in the mornings and the villagers bring them prepared food. The monks don't store food, they don't prepare food, they don't have cookware, and you only really see them in the morning. Because afternoon, they're involved in their spiritual pursuits, meditation, whatever. And we talked about this a little bit before as well, so hopefully you remember this conversation. I'm not going to test you on this, but there's 5 precepts to live by that everybody embraces, and none of them would be strange to you. They would kind of look like, the main tenets of the 10 Commandments. But there are 5 additional precepts for monastics that are interesting, and while I won't test you on them, I promised I would share these with you just to give you a little bit of an idea what it's like to be in a monastery. And by the way, this isn't just Buddhism. This could pertain to Jainism or Hinduism or any number of different monasteries. But specifically, in the Buddhist monasteries, first of all, they don't eat after noon. They eat in the morning. And there's something good about that. You fulfill all of your bodily needs in the morning. And if you've never been used to fulfilling them in the afternoon, then you don't ever get distracted thinking about something that you'd like because you've never fulfilled those necessary desires in the afternoon. So this kind of departmentalizing of your life actually works well. Number two, it says that they don't sleep on wide beds. And when you say wide, it doesn't just mean wide this way, but it can mean wide this way. The idea is you sleep on a bed that's just comfortable enough to where you can get the sleep you need, but there's nothing about that bed that makes you want to stay in bed longer than you need to. Now, some of us have that problem. We have very comfortable beds. And it's time to get up in the morning and we try to move and we find out that roots have grown out of our butt into the mattress and it's very difficult to move. So they're trying to avoid getting attached to sleep. And third thing is they don't use any personal ornamentation. That's why they all try to look the same. Obviously, not everybody looks the same, but the point is when you try to wear something different than everybody else is wearing, or you try to do your hair different or makeup different or wear different jewelry, you're trying to promote your individuality. And the whole idea, as we talked about, that your whole self-image, your whole identity really is an illusion, then promoting your individuality, it's easy to see, would be very counterintuitive and detrimental to your spiritual quest, to your spiritual pursuit. Next, they don't engage in any kind of entertainment. And that's interesting because whether we're talking about drama or tragedy or comedy or whatever it is, generally we're finding entertainment in the relationships between different people. And those relationships are based on how people affect other people's feeling of their value. You know, are you validating them? Are you demoralizing them? And all of this is based on a false idea of who you are and how things affect you in the first place. So based on our discussion of this in the last lecture, it should be pretty easy for you to understand why this would be counterproductive. And lastly, they're not supposed to handle money. And I don't need to explain this much. All religions agree that the love of money can be the root of all kinds of evil. And so the whole idea is not to get attached to money itself. I guess that's all I'm going to say about this right now. And again, I'm not going to test you on these things. Now, in the Sangha, the enlightened monk, the monk that has attained a detachment to a place to where the monk is not experiencing the kind of existential suffering that most people are in this life, that enlightened monk is called an arhat. Now, sometimes, as you'll see there, the word will have an N in it before the last T. Sometimes it will not. This is an enlightened monk. And if the monk is enlightened in this life, if the monk has attained nirvana in this life, it stands to reason that when the monk dies, the monk will attain final nirvana and not come back to this world of suffering anymore. Very good. There's a note here. Nirvana, as we mentioned before, just like salvation in Christianity, could be a term that refers to someone's state while still living in this world. If I say that, I've found salvation or I've attained nirvana, but I'm still breathing, obviously that means something very different than the salvation or nirvana we're talking about when we talk about this life being over and attaining salvation or attaining nirvana. And we mentioned this at the very beginning of the semester, that sometimes the already and not then goals, as we nicknamed them, sometimes might have the same terminology. The context usually tells you what you're talking about. However, just in case the context is not perfectly clear, some scholars use the term parinirvana to refer to final nirvana after this life to make sure that it's not confused with nirvana referring to some kind of enlightenment experience in this life. There are two forms of meditation, samatha and vipassana. You'll sometimes see samatha spelled S-A-M-A-T-T-A, which is really kind of the way it's pronounced. And I'm not going to test you on the two forms of meditation, but certainly read about them in your book, and you can research more on them if you like. Theravada is located mainly in Southeast Asia today, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, or Burma. And by the way, the slide says Burma, but it should be Burma, and I will change it to an M after I'm done with this, and Sri Lanka. Now, there's also quite a lot of Theravada in Vietnam, but the reason Vietnam's not up here is because Zen Buddhism is actually a little bit bigger in Vietnam than Theravada. So these are the 5 countries where Theravada would be the major form of Buddhism. Okay? Now, in going on here, in talking about Mahayana, we're going to have a slightly different dynamic. Here's why. Theravada, although there are different forms of Theravada in the different countries Theravada spread to, still, because Theravada tried not to change for 2,500 years, it's changed a lot less. So the different forms of Theravada have a lot more in common than the different forms of Mahayana. So I've been able to talk about Theravada kind of universally here. When I get to Mahayana, I'm not going to be able to do that so much. I'm going to make some general statements, but as you'll see, there are sometimes exceptions to the rule because there are different forms of Mahayana that really don't bear a lot of resemblance to each other sometimes. So Mahayana, and again, I put including Vajrayana. First of all, the Buddha is more than a man. Now, what the Buddha is, or what other Buddhas or Bodhisattvas are, can vary quite a bit. And we're going to get more into that when we get into the different forms of Mahayana in the next lecture. But I will talk a little bit about that using the example of Vajrayana in just a few more minutes. We also mentioned that additional Sanskrit sutras were received after the Buddha's death. And here's the thing that is huge in Mahayana, is that help is available towards the goal. Now, there's an exception here, which is Zen, especially if you're talking about Zen monks. Now, if you're talking about Zen laity, they're not quite as rigidly hanging on to the idea that no help is available. But Zen monks would say, much like Theravada monks, that, enlightenment is through their own effort. And so since Zen in this regard is much like Theravada, at least among the monks, that, a god or a ritual can't get you to enlightenment, why is Zen very different from Theravada? Why is it not considered a form of Theravada? Well, again, remember the litmus test. It's the line right above that, the second line. Zen, just like the other forms of Mahayana, accept the additional Sanskrit sutras as enlightened teachings, the ones received after the Buddha's death. And that makes them Mahayana conclusively. But in other forms of Mahayana, there's lots of help available towards the goal. From many Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, rituals, it's kind of nutty. So how did this all happen? Well, let's talk about it. First of all, let's just think about religion in general, okay? What is the number one thing that anybody turns to religion for? It's a four-letter word, and it starts with H, and it's certainly not hell. It is help. People are looking for some kind of help. What kind? Many kinds. Maybe help in navigating the problems of this life. Maybe help in becoming a better person, having more inner peace, or, attaining the ideal goal after this life is over. But whatever the deal, people are looking for help. So when you take Theravada in its rightful form and you bring it to people and you say, here's my gospel, here's my good news, there is no help available at all from gods or rituals. When you're talking to people that have been praying to gods and goddesses their whole lives and see this as a beautiful thing, and they're involved in many rituals that they see as being deeply meaningful, and you come and you say, all of these things are meaningless, throw them away, how many converts do you think you're going to have? Correct answer is 0, none. Someone would have to be completely marginalized and rejected from their society and their religion to embrace something that would cause them to throw away everything they've ever considered good and noble and true and honorable. People don't respond well when you tell them that everything they've considered to be good and holy and wonderful is actually evil or useless and they have to throw it away. Make sense? So, when you're leading people to a religion, they're looking for some kind of help. And if you're going to people that are already very religious, they're already looking for help. And so I'm going to use the example here of Vajrayana, which again we call Tibetan Buddhism, because it moves to Tibet and it actually flourishes there. It's a strange combination of Mahayana, of forms of tantric Hinduism that very much see rituals as almost being magical. And but it's also a syncretism with the indigenous religion of Tibet called Bon. So when Mahayana, the form called Vajrayana, goes to Tibet, and they encounter all of these people that have all these gods and goddesses that they consider precious, that they've been praying to, what the Vajrayanas tell them is that, these gods and goddesses you're praying to, it is wonderful. They really want to help you. They love you. In fact, there's something you may not know about them. Here's how they became gods and goddesses. They used to be just like you. but they broke through and they attained their Buddha nature, and that is how they are now in a position where they can help you. But here's the really good thing you didn't know before. They're not just here to help you, with the menial things of this life. They want to help you also to attain your Buddha nature so you can become just like them. And one day when you've escaped reincarnation back into this evil world, then you can be in this spiritual realm where you can also help other people on their way to attaining their Buddha nature, and you too will be a Bodhisattva, having attained your Buddha nature and being a Buddha in waiting. I know that's a lot really quickly, but it makes a lot of sense, right? What they've done is what I told you always have to do if you want to win somebody over. Don't discredit the things that they think are valuable. Accept them. And so what we've said is your gods and goddesses, they're not only great, but they're better than you ever knew they were before. Let me tell you why they're even better than you ever thought they were. They used to be like you. And they not only want to help you out in other ways, but they want to help you to become like they are, so one day you can be just like them, helping other people on their way to enlightenment. This works like a charm. So what you get are many different rituals and gods and goddesses of Bon, the indigenous religion, that's accepted into Vajrayana, and it's all kind of merged together. So at this point, whether you call someone you're praying to a Buddha or a god, it just doesn't matter. Whether you're calling it a Bodhisattva or a goddess, it just doesn't matter. They're the same beings. God and goddess is just kind of like the everyday understanding of their superiority to you, but a true recognition of how they got there and what they really want to help you with. I mean, the number one asset they can be in your life. Now, the terms Buddha and Bodhisattva demonstrate a little bit more understanding of who they are and what their point is. So this is how it works. It's wonderful. Now, at this point, you can see the ranks of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are multiplied immediately, not just because we're adding gods and goddesses, but now anybody who attains some kind of enlightenment or is thought to have died and attained their Buddha nature is thought to now be a Bodhisattva helping you on your way. So the ranks of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas multiply exponentially. And that's why we end up with thousands of them. Obviously, the ones that you pray to are going to be the ones that are the most important in your particular form of Buddhism, or maybe the ones that are most important in your particular area where you live, in your subculture or whatever. But there are many, many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, both heavenly and alive on earth. Now, again, this is something so different from what Siddhartha taught. Some people would think that he would probably be turning over in his grave screaming, "You fools, you've messed it all." But anyway, now here's the interesting thing. If my heroes are those that are helping me, and they want to help me to become the kind of people that they are, then what will I do once I become the kind of people they are? Well, I will do the same thing that they are doing. I will help each other. In fact, the desire to be in the position to help others is absolutely required to attain enlightenment in the first place. So to become a bodhisattva, to become an enlightened human who is going to go on to become a spiritual bodhisattva, one of the things that's absolutely important is the vow of the bodhisattva. It's sometimes called the vow of compassion. And that is that you will wait in the spiritual realms. In other words, when you die, theoretically, you've attained nirvana, enlightenment. You could pass into final nirvana. But you take a vow that you will not pass into final nirvana. You will stay in the spiritual realms, the liminal spaces, whatever you want to call them, to help other people on their way all the way through the end of this yuga until finally the last have attained enlightenment. And at that point, we will all pass into final nirvana together. So again, now we've got a real difference. In Theravada, to go back for a moment, remember, the ideal person is the enlightened monk we call an arhat. This monk can't help anybody else on their way in any way, shape, or form. It's a precept of the religion that the monk can't. So when an enlightened monk dies, they pass into final nirvana. Mahayana changes everything. Now there are so many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and you're taking a vow that when you die as an enlightened Bodhisattva, you will not pass into final nirvana, but you will stay to help people on the way. So now not only is help available, but you're trying to get in a position where you can actually provide that help for other people. So this is a real good example of how this syncretism happens, and we end up with so many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Last thing, the Mahayana focuses more on the laity, not just monks. So in Theravada, only the monks can really attain enlightenment in the first place. Mahayana does not believe that. In Mahayana, especially in different kinds of Mahayana, there are different levels of enlightenment. Now, it's granted, the ultimate enlightenment that you can attain, say in Zen, you're going to have to be a Zen monk, sitting in Zazen, doing this meditational work probably for some time. But even though you might be a layperson and not be a monk, and thus not attain that final breakthrough, still there are levels of enlightenment that you can attain in this life, which will give you a much higher quality of life, much less existential suffering, much more peace within, in your relationships with people. And someone who is not a monk, a layperson, can attain some level of enlightenment in Zen. So that's one of the things that makes it a little bit different from Theravada. And of course, the scriptures are the big thing. But in terms of how the monks meditate, there's a lot of similarities there. Now, Vajrayana, as we already know, it spread north into Tibet and was the major religion in Tibet until, in the 20th century, Mao Zedong and the People's Republic of China, the communist government that destroyed the imperial line, outlawed it. And that was when the Tibetan lamas had to flee, or some of them were actually disappeared by the Chinese government. I'm sorry, I like using disappear as a transitive verb. Hope it doesn't bother you too much. Nepal, Bhutan, Mongolia, also forms of Vajrayana, are the main forms of Buddhism in those areas. Now, there are other forms of Vajrayana in different areas too, but these are the areas where this is predominant. And again, as I said before, it's a syncretism of Mahayana, Hindu Tantrism, and the Bon shamanic religion. There's some other significant Japanese Mahayana sects besides Zen, Pure Land, and Vajrayana. Zen and Pure Land head east into China. From China, they head to Korea, Japan, and other points east. So China is the main home base for Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism. But in the 20th century, when all religion is outlawed in China, at that point, Buddhism, just like everything else, no, it's not a key. So we start to think of Japan as being the home ground for Zen and Pure Land. In fact, that's why we call it Zen. If you remember talking about Hinduism, we mentioned that the Hindu term for meditation is jhana, D-H-Y-A-N-A. And we mentioned that in China, it's Chan. And in Japan, it's Zen. So we're calling this form of Buddhism by its Japanese name, Zen, not its Chinese name, Chan. And that's one of the reasons for that. Likewise with Pure Land. The two major forms of Pure Land are Japanese forms, Jodoshu and Jodoshinshu. And the two main forms of Zen are Japanese forms, Renzai and Soto. So Japan is kind of seen as kind of the home base now, and that's why. The other Japanese Mahayana sects, there's two of them that actually come from China as well, but really develop in Japan, and that's Tendai and Shingon. And we're not really going to talk about them. You probably aren't going to run into these kinds of Buddhists in this country. However, I do want to talk about Nichiren a little bit for two reasons. Number one, Nichiren is an exception to a rule. Now, we learn rules, and that's important, but there's always exceptions to the rules. For instance, we learned that help is available towards the goal in Mahayana. What would the exception to the rule be? Zen, especially the Zen monks. Okay, so what is the rule Nichiren is breaking? Let me tell you the rule. Forget Nichiren for a moment, and here's the rule. Mahayana Buddhism tends to be more inclusive, syncretistic, liberal, if you will, inclusive, and you can pick many other terms, while Theravada tends to be more conservative or exclusive, okay? We can understand why, right? Theravada is not open to too much change, so there's all kinds of like deal breakers that would have them say, no, not the right form of Buddhism. But Mahayana is much more open to syncretism and change. So Mahayana is much more likely to accept other forms of Mahayana and, Theravada for that matter, than Theravada to accept Mahayana. It's not as bad as it is in the West. I mean, I'm sorry about that. It's not like different forms of Mahayana are telling each other they're going to hell, or Theravadins are telling Mahayanists they're going to hell. That's not really a feature of Eastern religions the way it is with some forms of Christianity and some forms of Islam. But there is the same kind of idea based on a based on a difference of opinion about the canon. Theravada sees the canon as being closed at a much earlier date. At a much earlier date, you can't add anything to their Bible, so to speak. Whereas Mahayana is continuing to add things to their corpus of sacred scriptures for a long time. And you can see other examples of this. One good example of this, for instance, would be, say, a conservative form of Christianity, whether Protestant or Catholic, compared with, say, Church of the Latter-day Saints, often called the Mormons. The number one reason that some other forms of Christianity don't want to accept Mormons as real Christians is because they believe that they have added to the canon. Now, in Christianity, the canon was closed at the latest by 367 AD or CE. There is a letter written by a theologian named Athanasius called the Paschal Letter then that lists the exact same books that are in the Christian New Testament today. So by 367, possibly earlier, but by 367, there seems to be some kind of widespread agreement exactly which books are part of the canon of the New Testament. That makes sense? The Jewish canon was closed somewhere around 90 of the Common Era, in that last decade of the Common Era as well. But back to Christianity. If you know anything about the Church of the Latter-day Saints, they believe that an angel named Moroni appeared to a guy named Joseph Smith and revealed a whole bunch of new information. And they have a number of sacred texts that come out of that are considered to be authoritative. For instance, the Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price. And so again, some other Christians might find fault with them for adding to the canon. But the interesting thing is the relationship, if you get away with the Western monotheistic tendency to pronounce everyone going to hell, forget that. But the relationship is very much the same. Take someone very conservative, take someone like a Southern Baptist or someone like that would say, no, you're off the path. You've lost the truth. You've embraced the lie. And but a Mormon talking to a Southern Baptist would actually, strangely enough, be a little bit kinder and say, look, we are glad you love the Bible. We're glad you love the New Testament. We're glad you love Jesus. We love him too. We're so glad you're saved. We believe that you are. But what a shame that you just don't want to be a part of this wonderful work that God is doing in the latter days on earth. But we're sure that after you die, you'll realize your error and God will accept you and everything's going to be okay. Isn't that interesting? So in a sense, the Mormon, according to my hypothetical example, and please don't be offended if you're a Southern Baptist. I have many friends that are Southern Baptists, so I feel safe using the example. But again, the Mormons would tend to be a little bit nicer to the Southern Baptists than the Southern Baptists would be to the Mormon. And it would be the same way in Buddhism generally. Mahayana would be a lot more accepting of Theravada than Theravada would be of Mahayana. That's the rule. Now here's the exception to the rule. Nichiren. It is a uniquely form of Japanese Buddhism, and Nichiren, who founded it, actually has a very exclusivistic idea. And that is that all of the other sects of Buddhism that he knows of, he feels like have substantially left the path. Their religion is polluted by wrong ideas, practices, whatever. And so he thinks that this form of Buddhism that he's found in Nichiren is the last true form of Buddhism that's really hanging on to the truth. And again, that's a very exclusivistic idea that you are like the last, chosen few that are still faithful. So again, Nichiren would be an example to this rule that Mahayana would generally be more open, accepting, inclusive, liberal, syncretistic than Theravada. Nichiren would be an exception to the rule because Nichiren is pretty exclusive, kind of like Theravadins would feel. Now, there's one other reason I told you I'm going to mention Nichiren, and that is because in terms of forms of Buddhism that you might find in the United States today, which you can probably tell from my accent is where I'm broadcasting from, there is a form called Soka Gakkai, and it is actually an offshoot of Nichiren. Now, they're much more open than original Nichiren was, but they're very evangelical. They are, trying to convert people. They focus an awful lot on chanting, and the chant that they love, that they believe really kind of actualizes all kinds of power in their life is Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And again, I mention this because there are groups here in the United States. In fact, there is a Soka Gakkai Fellowship near the St. Petersburg Clearwater Airport that I visited a couple times. I have friends that went there that invited me. In fact, one of the most interesting conversations that I heard just by chance, I was waiting for a friend of mine to show up at a Starbucks one day, and we were going to have a conversation, and he was late. And at one of the tables outside, it was a beautiful day, there were 3 people sitting. One guy was not speaking. There were 2 other guys that were talking with each other, and one of them was a Pure Land Buddhist, and the other one was a Soka Gakkai Buddhist, and the Soka Gakkai Buddhist was trying to convert the Pure Land Buddhist. Now, you may not know me, but this is the kind of stuff I live for. So I went over there and I just said, look, I said, I find this conversation going on to be so interesting. Can I please just sit down and listen? And of course they said yes, because what evangelist doesn't want to increase the number of people listening to your message? I found it absolutely marvelous to listen to them comparing different forms of Buddhism and what they considered to be more valid and more useful. And it was too much to go into here, but what a wonderful example. So again, that's why I included this, because you might run into Soka Gakkai. You certainly might run into different varieties of Zen Buddhists. You also can certainly run into Pure Land Buddhists. That's the most similar thing to, say, Christianity. So it's the easiest thing for a monotheist to understand. And we're going to talk about that a lot in the next lecture, as I mentioned. And of course, you'll run into Theravada. And in terms of the deeper understanding of the Four Noble Truths that we talked about, as I said, if you really want to discuss this in these terms, your best bet is to find yourself a Theravada monk. In Theravada, you're going to find what seems to be more the pure understanding of the Buddha, especially in his first 2 generations of disciples. Okay. And I think that's all we really need to do on this. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to pick up here, and we're going to start right where we're leaving off now. We're going to start with this page here about the major Mahayana divisions. We've already talked about Vajrayana a bit because I used it as an example, but we're going to talk about it more. We're going to talk more about Zen. We're going to talk more about Pure Land and the different kinds of Pure Land. And we're going to talk about that big fat Buddha that you see in the Chinese restaurants, because guess what? He's not Siddhartha. You probably figured that out. Eating 1 meal a day, nobody's going to get a big old semi-spare tire around their gut like that. Siddhartha, by all accounts, was thin till the day he died. You could count his ribs from a distance. So who is this fat Buddha? Where does he come from? We'll talk about all of that in the next, and we'll also talk about the spread and decline of Buddhism through the centuries. So I will see you for the next lecture. Thank you very much. See you next time.